Good morning, Father Keating. My name is Tom, and I'm an alcoholic and a member of Crane Road AA Group in Westchester, New York. Our meeting today is a culmination of many discussions and meetings that we've had relating to AA's 12 steps over the past 5 years, in which we explored the first 11 steps. It's fitting that we meet here at St. Benedict's Monastery in Snowmass, Colorado, which is your home base. And I want to thank Abbot Joseph Boyle for permitting this video taping of the interview within these beautiful surroundings. Our hope is that these discussions will help current AA members by broadening their view of each step and at the same time deepening their spiritual understanding of what is being said. There are two segments to today's interview. The first I've labeled Practicing the Principles, and the second segment will be a review of the 12th step in depth. Over the past few weeks, I've pondered over this work, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we left something out in our prior discussions, something important. The missing link, it occurred to me, is the implementation process, or what we call in AA practicing the principles. How does an AA member take all of this 12-step information, including the basic principles, absorb same into his psyche, and live it intuitively on a daily basis? Certainly, our process of doing the 12 steps in AA has been quite successful. Bill Wilson, though, he saw room for improvement. In 1958, Bill wrote an article for the Grapevine entitled The Next Frontier, Emotional Sobriety, which you're familiar with. In his opening statement, Bill refers to the many AA oldsters who lack emotional sobriety. He speaks of the next development in AA, basically a deeper spiritual growth. He also states that our primary healing circuit, God's love, cannot flow until our paralyzing dependencies are broken, and broken in depth. For 11 years, Bill suffered from periodic depression episodes. He wrote in 1953 to a friend in Detroit who was also suffering from depression, "Your personality is ever so much like mine. Maybe we will find how the 12 steps can work in depth." He's constantly looking at how these steps can work in depth. But here was a co-founder of AA and the writer of the 12 steps suffering from depression. Nell Wing, Bill's longtime secretary, described them as crippling depressions. In 1953, Bill wrote that his relief finally came after what he described as a second conversion experience. Bill had faced his own recovery issues at deeper levels. Now, as I understand it, all spiritual movements had to face, at one time or another, very similar problems. That is, how to develop a deep understanding of their foundation documents, whether it's Scripture, the Bible, the Quran. This involved prayerful reading, reflection, repetition, resting in God, and so forth, in varying degrees depending on their desires for emphasis. During the latter half of the 1900s, there was a movement to revive some of the ancient prayer practices, and you, Father Keating, have been in the forefront of the effort, especially in regard to prayerful reading of Scripture, contemplative prayer, and centering prayer as a preparation for it. It dawned on me that we could adopt the key ingredients of these practices in a non-sectarian way, so that in AA, so that we could reach that level that Bill fought for so many years. That is a level of life in which the principles of AA become so infused in our psyche that we instinctively live them in the activities of our daily life, after which the joy of living becomes our way of living. So how do we get there? How can we take the best out of your prayer practices and centering prayer practices and use it to attain the in-depth understanding and absorption of the 12 steps that eluded Bill Wilson for so many years. The first step, it seems to me, Father Keating, is to briefly review the original practice with you. Then perhaps we can discuss each of the key ingredients with the hope that it would be converted into a second non-sectarian template for use by AA members seeking to implement the principles of the 12 steps in their daily lives in depth. I think we're on the right track. In April 1953, Bill's close friend, Father Ed Dowling, wrote to him and said, "I suggest that the steps be a book to be meditated rather than read." So we have prepared an exhibit headed "The Process of Divine Intimacy," which is on the side there. I think, Father Keating, it capsulizes the process used by many, particularly early Christians and later Christians, whereby they developed a deep understanding of the principles of their faith and the ability to live them intuitively in their lives. With that introduction, Father, would you comment on the first ingredient of this process that was used and how it might be adopted in a non-sectarian way for the AA member trying to understand and live each step instinctively in his life? And the first ingredient of that process is reading as listening to God. Would you comment on that, Father?
I'd be glad to try. This is a very essential ingredient of, as far as I can see, all of the great spiritual traditions that the world religions have evolved or which they received from some great founder. All spiritual traditions have a wisdom literature. Now, AA, it seems to me, is a spiritual tradition, and its influence and spread in the present century is going to depend a lot on how well each generation of those in recovery assimilates and interiorizes the basic wisdom that is enshrined in your case in the 12 steps and the 12 traditions. So there's nothing new about reading a text in a certain way with a certain discipline and with a certain reference that prepares our faculties, body, soul, and spirit, to access the goal of every spiritual practice, which is intimacy with the divine. Now, I realize that for beginners in AA, the group itself is the higher power to begin with, or something else, and that can be completely respected if you simply accept the term divine intimacy for intimacy with the higher power, whatever it is. In the great spiritual traditions of the world, there are sacred texts like the Vedas, the Upanishads in Hinduism, the Buddhist Sutras, the Quran, the Old Testament and the New Testament, just to mention a few. So what you're really asking me to do is to review the basic ingredients of how to read the inspired text of AA in a way that furthers accessing the spiritual dimension of the higher power or our true self, which contains what true happiness is. In other words, this is a fairly highly tested and thoroughly experienced procedure for interiorizing the wisdom of the particular tradition we're in. Well, today we're talking about the 12 steps of AA, which, if you don't consider it a sacred text, at least it's a very important text if you consider that it presents people with a choice of life and death. That is an important text. So you better darn well hear it. So this procedure or process of accessing divine intimacy is a process of how to read an inspired or sacred text in such a way that it prepares our human faculties, body, soul, and spirit, to be disposed to receive the gift of wisdom that the authors or the community of AA, which has received this tradition, is trying to pass on to those in desperate need of it right now. And that means you, whoever you are. So I thought I would just suggest a few examples on each of these 4 steps that access what might be called the mystery. Here, mystery is not in the sense of some novel or drama, but in the sense of a truth, experience, or presence that is beyond our reach at this point in our life, and which we can't normally access, but at times kind of intuit, if it's only by the sense of desperate need that we experience as a takeoff point in the first step. To feel one's life unmanageable is itself an experience of the divine. Who says it's unmanageable? Something deep within us, our personal experience, the disarray of our relatives and friends and business or ministry, all of these things point to a presence that is challenging us, sometimes accusing us of missing the mark, of falling overboard, or of losing what more and more we had hoped would provide us with happiness. The happiness is there. The deepest root of our being is, at least in the Christian tradition, the image of God. This is reflected somewhat in the Buddhist tradition by the Buddha, or in the Hindu tradition by the Atman. In other words, it's a spark, not articulated, of the divine that dwells in each of us, and the tradition of the Old and New Testament call it an image. In other words, the God, which is a term for the ultimate reality in the Judeo-Christian tradition, has created us in his own image, that is to say, the goodness, tenderness, beauty, happiness of God is mirrored in us at the deepest level of our being. And it's in accessing the root of our being that we find out what true happiness is, instead of seeking it desperately in things that cannot satisfy, or in self-made programs for happiness that simply do not work and have brought some people to the first stage of AA, in which they realize profoundly and existentially that none of their programs for happiness are working or ever will work. So let us look at this process of accessing the true self, the image of God within us, or the higher power within us. Buddhists call the Buddha nature, or in the Zen tradition, the absolute self, capital S, as opposed to the false self with a small s, that is our day-to-day psychological experience of ourselves, and which we used to like, or tried to like, or never quite liked, as depending on our experience in life, but is basically an illusion that is the epitome of what we mean by the human condition as experienced without the presence of what true happiness is, or any idea of where to find it, when you know that nothing else will provide you with that delight or that fulfillment of our potentiality. Well, anyway, for what it's worth, the first step in, you might say, in reading a sacred text is to reverence it. Listen to it with receptivity and respect, and care about it. Now, I know that you read a chapter or a few pages from the 12 Steps and 12 Traditions as part of your AA ritual, you might say. Every sacred object or text usually has a certain ritual built around it. That's the way human nature is. It has to symbolize the experiences that it is perceiving or receiving. There's a natural tendency to do that. And so your ritual, it seems to me, you gather in the group very often, and someone says, I'm Butch, I'm an alcoholic. You identify yourself, and you have the reading, a special reading, and then you launch out into the experience of the meeting, where you follow certain rules or of procedure. And then you end with the serenity prayer, or whatever. I haven't attended that many meetings to have memorized your ritual. But there's obviously an attempt here to impress upon those who come that this is an important meeting. Hence, they need to be there with all their faculties, attentively. And it's this attentiveness that is important when a text is read of this importance in a public place. You might say it really needs to be proclaimed, not just read. And so not just anybody should pick up the book and read, but it should be someone who normally has had the time to read it before, to reflect on it, and to articulate the words clearly so everyone in the room can hear it, and to give a certain emphasis to important sentences and words without putting oneself on display, so to speak.
To get that attentiveness, would you suggest maybe a little prayer to start, or maybe a little silence before?
Well, you've had your prayer. Have you not?
Well, we usually
Do you start with a prayer?
No, we
Well,
usually
this is for you to figure out in a particular group. I'm not doing anything but presenting a way of learning how to listen to a text.
So it would be good to start with some prayer.
I think so, but if nobody
develop that
wants to
attentiveness.
pray, I don't see why you have to.
Right.
Just coming together with this purpose is itself a prayer. Prayer in a very broad sense, perhaps, but we tend to narrow the term prayer. Prayer basically means a relationship with the higher power in your language. In our language, it's a relationship with God. And what I'm going to present here as the process of divine intimacy is precisely that. A path to assimilating and being assimilated by what in AA is the inspired text. Whatever you mean by inspired. It's important, it's significant, it's life-changing, it's a choice between life and death, for many people at least. So suppose then that this text is read in public and everyone listens in silence and attentiveness, receptivity. And if it's well proclaimed so that everybody hears it and is respectfully but modestly presented so that the meaning can be grasped by everybody, then normally people will begin to see, as the text is read again and again, certain aspects that they didn't see in the beginning, and it begins to be repetitive in such a way that each time it's repeated, there's some nourishment somewhere in the text or in the reading as a whole.
It's not repeated at the meeting, it's just read once and then it's read
Well,
again
I
at
mean
some other.
repeated every time you go to a meeting.
Right, right.
Hence the need to attend the meetings from that perspective.
Some groups have, they do the first step in January, the second step in February, and so forth, so they cover all the steps in their step meetings during a year.
Sure. Well, whatever they do is fine. I'm only suggesting here what is a kind of summary of the tradition of how to listen to an important or sacred text. Sacred is the word they use in these spiritual traditions with a religious base. Important or significant or important or life-changing, whatever word is appropriate for AA folks, is the one to use. And so, since I can't use every possibility in describing this, we're calling it in general the process of divine intimacy. And it involves 4 stages, plus a vestibule and a conclusion. And in the assimilation of sacred reading, in some sense, reading it, the same text in private, is just as important and often more important than reading it in public. I mentioned the public aspect of it because it is enriching. But to get the full benefit of it, one needs to be in a situation where somebody else is reading the text and you're just listening. In this process of divine intimacy, you're reading the text, hence you can stop at any time in order to reflect and respond in the presence of the higher power to the insights that you may be receiving. So you may not read the whole thing because of time. And as time goes on, you may only need to read one sentence to be completely absorbed in some insight, or for one's feelings and emotions to be involved in something that the text has suscitated in your unconscious or conscious understanding. So since this is a very important and significant aspect of daily life, it needs a vestibule, a sort of remote preparation before you even begin. And so you need to choose a place that is silent, a certain amount of solitude, where you won't be interrupted, where you can prolong your concentration. And you need to fix a certain amount of minimal time in which to do this. Perhaps 20 minutes or half an hour might not be too long, but certainly at least 15 minutes to get into the text is recommended. And then when you have more time, more leisure, you might, on special days, add more. In other words, this method is a methodless procedure. In other words, you can do what you feel attracted to do within the parameters of reading, reflecting, responding to what you reflect on, and culminating in moments in which one rests in God or in the thought or the insight or the emotional affect that you might have experienced. that we do in private then will go better if before we sit down we have dissipated in some degree our preoccupations or any tension. And this can be done in a number of ways, such as light exercise, walking around the block, maybe having a cup of tea, or reading something that releases us from the preoccupations that we might be under or the emotional tension. So that when we sit down, we're not sitting down, on a red-hot coals. And so when we sit down, the body needs to remain in repose and quiet, and hence that preparation, body needs to be taken into account. And then our imagination and our memory can be focused a little bit by a reading that is short, maybe half a minute, but a minute depends on how upset you are. This approach is based, from the Christian perspective, on the four aspects of the traditional practice of Lectio Divina, which means reading what we believe to be divinely inspired texts. So in the monastic tradition, where tens of thousands of monks from the 3rd or 4th century on have used this process to divine intimacy as the central focus of their training, is worth considering, and it could be looked upon as a kind of distillation of the essence of monastic relationship with the higher power, whom the monks usually call God. In any case, the first experience of the reading is like everybody else. It's not like other reading. It's not like even reading a spiritual book. It's about listening to God, who is believed to be the inspirer of this text. So it's not really reading when you're doing it privately. It's listening. The monks even spoke the words out loud as they read it in order to impress the text on their bodies as well as on their minds. The two are so interrelated. So the four essences, or principles, you might say, of monastic relationship with the higher power are an ingredient, could be more or less, of silence, solitude, a discipline of prayer, and simplicity of lifestyle. So to really read a sacred text, it's also helpful in daily life to simplify it in regard to overeating, over-entertainment, overwork. In other words, to balance our body, soul, and spirit so that each part of us receives nourishment from a spiritual source, like a text like AA, on a regular basis. It's like spiritual food. And normal food, you need both almost every day. And this brings us then, having settled down in this vestibule, to the actual listening process. And here, it's not a question of how much we read. Normally we'll want to read, think through several times, but at some point we need to be alerted to the fact that God is speaking to us through this text. And to listen involves letting go of all the noise around us, our preoccupations, and concerns about the past or future at this moment. But just think for a moment what the process of listening is to anything. What are you doing when you're listening deeply to something? Music, a speaker? Nothing at all. And the less you do in the way of activity, body, mind, and spirit, and to simply attend to what is being said or heard, the more satisfaction or gratification or enrichment or nourishment one actually receives from the beauty or the information or the insight that the speaker might be offering. So it's not being uptight, it's just being fully attentive to the text and nothing else, so that other thoughts that arise that are extraneous should be ignored at this time. And that's where the significance or importance of the text needs to be a high priority when we sit down in the first place. This is the most important thing to do at this moment. Unless there's an explosion or something and you're in a flood, obviously you have to adapt to special circumstances. But normally, this is the time to give oneself to the listening process and nothing else. And so one reads as one listens. That is to say, one reads not to dominate the text, but to receive the text and to assimilate it and to be assimilated by it, which is a totally different process than the casual reading of the newspaper or reading a novel that's interesting or exciting, all of which have their values, but not in this kind of reading. They're totally excluded. So it doesn't matter how much of the text you actually read. So you read until something strikes you or moves you to reflect with your own thoughts on what the author has said or what you're listening to. And this is an invitation to put down the particular chapter you're in of the 12-step, 12 traditions, and allow your imagination and your memory and your conceptual apparatus to think about this. It may involve reflecting on certain aspects of our life, or certain memories, or certain life situations we're in. But you don't have to decide anything. You're just listening and using your mind to cultivate the insights you've received and to develop them yourself. And when that insight subsides, you continue to read on. And so you sort of weave yourself through the text. The warp and woof being your intention to listen and your attentiveness, your practical attentiveness that is manifested by not pursuing randomly other thoughts that intervene from whatever source, sense perceptions, memories, or plans for the future. Well, when thoughts or insights are especially powerful, or when there's a kind of aha experience that something you read about strikes intimately your intuitive apparatus or your reflection, and you say, that's me, or I know what that means, or I've experienced that, then your emotions and feelings begin to be involved, which vastly improves your concentration on the text and the insight and the encounter, so that you're in relationship with something. You're calling it the higher power. You're in relationship to the greatest teacher there is. You're in relationship to a personal love that is overwhelming and incomprehensible to us, but is nonetheless real, and which begins to manifest itself not directly, but through the peace or encouragement or nourishment or instruction or edification. All these words are signs that someone is enriching you in this encounter, which is almost a conversation. So that in a sense it is a conversation in which the texts that you're reading immediately provides this topic for today. So out of a sense of receptivity and reverence for this great teacher that the higher power is, one doesn't follow one's own thoughts all over the place, but tries to maintain a listening attentiveness and to follow the program of conversation or topics of conversation that speak to one's mind and are now beginning to speak to one's heart. So notice the progression here. Reading as listening, even to the point of saying the words out loud. Reading with attentiveness, respect, care, receptivity. And it's that disposition that unfolds into an invitation to reflect on some particular part of the text or sentence or word. And so you may read the same passage several times in order to fix it in your mind and to make sure that you mind all of the rich load that is contained in that particular inspiration of that part of the text. And when that subsides, as it usually does, then one goes back to the text and reads a little more. So you have the greatest flexibility to follow your inner attraction, either just to read, listen, just to reflect. But once your emotions and feelings are involved, let us say, of gratitude or need, or they almost certainly will call forth from our appetitive faculties, that is to say, desire and petitions or expressions of gratitude or praise or thanks. All of these dispositions arise sometimes spontaneously and sometimes a sense of as far as being united to something you don't know what, but which is extremely refreshing, caring, nurturing, and loving. And this positive experience begins to heal the deep wounds of self-hatred that may have arisen from the collapse of our expectations for happiness coming from our false self, or the lack of esteem we have for ourselves because of having not met the ideals of perfection or worldly success, material success, professional, marital, all the other forms of success that the world holds out as being great sources of satisfaction if you succeed. So the whole wretched cultural factor of success is relativized in this experience of finding out or perceiving the hollowness of the consumerist or materialistic objectives that advertising and the culture and education in many respects tends to pour into our consciousness 24 hours a day. And it's this constant propaganda against the values of the text and its practical consequences for us that requires the repetition of the same principles again and again. Otherwise, they'll be drowned out by the pressures coming from outside and the habits of listening, not to the text, but to the promises of the advertisers, which always appeal to one of three instinctual needs: security, power, and affection and esteem. These are true values, but the advertising world is trying to get us to have more and more needs so they can sell more and more of their stuff. And this is an aggregation of things, not a life, which is about quality, not quantity. Well, in any case, now this careful reader, as he's assimilating the text, and the text is assimilating him or her, is turned on by something in the text and is experiencing positive emotions, not the negative ones that accompanied its plunge into the first step of AA. It doesn't change its concerns for its need of help, but now it begins to have a sense that there is something to help, and that there's not just a big hole there, or a void, or a hopeless situation. In other words, the divine spark, the divine indwelling, a word from the Christian tradition, the Buddha nature, from the Buddha tradition, of course, the divine spark from the Advaitic Hindu tradition, it's beginning to vibrate. Why? Because it's always been there. It was just drowned out by the habits of seeking satisfaction and happiness in the wrong places with ever-increasing desperation, so that we wound up, when we came to full reflective self-consciousness, with an ego that made itself the center of the world, around which everything else was circulating like planets around the sun. So that when events or people entered into our gravitational field, they were judged not on their objective goodness, but rather on whether they served our particular emotional needs to find happiness in one of those three instinctual needs necessary for the infant, but most inappropriate for an adult human being. They become exaggerated, unlimited, boundless, and hence impossible to realize in early childhood, because there's no reason active to moderate them. And so they fossilize into personality traits and programs for happiness that make demands on our experience and on other people to fulfill our emotional needs, so that we will not feel their frustration. And when we do, if it's painful enough, especially in early childhood, these emotional trauma are repressed into the unconscious, and the body becomes a warehouse in which the negative energies are stored, and you can almost see them, or certainly contact some of them, in deep massage, where the masseuse can certainly feel pockets of grief, fear, panic, and so anger that have never been processed, and which are part of the emotional pain that we might call the addictive process. The addictive process is the accumulation of frustration and the afflictive emotions of anger, grief, fear, depression, discouragement, and so on. Or the satisfaction of them, which leads to elation and self-inflation and pride and so on, that prevent us from relating to the higher power, ourselves and other people, in a way that is truly human, and often manifests itself in subhuman activities, such as projecting our emotions onto others, where it's easier to despise them than in ourselves. So what this procedure or process of divine intimacy is doing is engaging our ordinary human faculties, even the body, in this process of relationship with the higher power, who is perfect happiness, of whom we are the image, and hence have within us now everything we need to be perfectly happy in the present moment, only we don't know it, because it's buried like a diamond under a heap, an enormous heap of garbage or layers of false self-programs, thoroughly defended and increased by the traumas of our lives as they unfold, and which alcohol or some other addiction have made impossible to live with.
Over the past 25 years, I've gone to, maybe 7,000 AA meetings. Nearly 2,000 of those were step meetings. And how I wish that before I began the step meetings, I went to some kind of a workshop where I could learn some of these principles you spoke about this morning on how to do the steps. I think the problem when Bill addresses the AA Ulsters is that we've had a habit of racing through the step, just reading it quickly and moving on to the next one, and not absorbing it deeply. And I think you're touching on that very deeply.
Well, we're coming to the deepest part of this discussion, or to what the other three forms of preparation, namely listening to God, speaking through the text, reflecting with God about the text, and responding to God as a result of being moved by the text, emotionally and even spiritually. But these are all preparations for something much more profound. The purpose of AA, as I understand it, is sobriety, recovery, and emotional stability. The words that you quoted from Bill W. At the beginning of our discussion. It's this fourth step, not of AA, but of the process of divine intimacy, that opens us in the most profound way to what will bring about emotional stability, which is the discovery of where true happiness is to be found. And this is called in the Christian tradition a resting in the presence of God. Practically speaking, this happens gradually as those three steps of assimilating the text are pursued every day, respectfully at an AA meeting, and privately through a period of 20 to 30 minutes of the prayerful reading of the text. Prayer meaning a relationship with the higher power and a receptivity to the wisdom that is being offered us in the text, that we're trying to assimilate. But as this trying to assimilate continues, once in a while, you slip into your true self. In other words, having thought about some insight in the text and having responded with a certain depth of emotion that can be very many different kinds of, but all being positive, there comes a moment when you no longer want to say the same responses because you're called to a deeper place in which the response is not conversation or words, but communing with this presence, with this insight, with this mystery. And this is what contemplative prayer came to be called in the Christian contemplative tradition. And it also has similar states of consciousness in the other great world religions, at least in their spiritual traditions. So now this is a little difficult to grasp, but I'll offer it for what it's worth, and perhaps sometime in your development you'll identify with it. But what happens when we slip into just being, just resting in the insight, or just resting in the disposition of receptivity, or sensing the presence of the higher power, without need to articulate it or explain it to ourselves. In other words, you move beyond reflection and the conceptual apparatus to an intuitive place where you ever so gently, but sometimes suddenly, become aware that you are lived in, that the deep you is a presence that is a participation in the divine consciousness itself. Hence, it's an experience of an intimacy that is deeper than is possible with any human being. But even in human love, this experience arises at times. Think of an elderly couple, for instance, who really love each other, sitting on the porch, maybe watching a sunset, if they can see one, or listening to music. They don't need to speak to each other to be happy, because they've moved from talking to an emotional exchange that identifies them with each other through the gift of their own presence to the other. So what they're celebrating in silence is self-surrender, the gift of each one to the other. And so for the moment, they don't need words. It doesn't mean that they won't use them the rest of the day, but these are kind of peak moments when they're aware that they're in touch with a higher intelligence, a higher communion, a higher presence, a higher love than they ordinarily experience in everyday wear and tear and the duties and the pressures of earning a living and raising a family and so on. Now, so resting in God is the experience of love, of being loved, and sometimes of experiencing one's own love without knowing what it is. But that experience of just being present to each other with a certain peace, contentment, and delight is what contemplative prayer in its normal form usually is. It's kind of it's like the prayer of quiet or of union. And it's this communion that awakens us to the deeper levels of happiness that are potentially waiting for us to respond to the invitation to deep knowledge of God.
Would you say then that this process is it's a gentle oscillation between spiritual activity and spiritual receptivity, an ascending spiral leading to divine union or the absorption?
Resting, yes, I presume you're referring to this process of the divine intimacy. Yes, there's
Both being very
each one of
important.
those steps has certain peak moments, and then they subside. So there's this dialogue going on between our activity and the inspiration that the text arouses within us. But sometimes the divine presence is even more powerful and comes about not just gently, but very powerfully. That's why these first three stages need to be put in place. The divine presence is always within us and is holding us in being at every moment, 24 hours a day. Creation is an ongoing act, it's continuous. So the fact that we're sitting here is because God is holding us in being, body, soul, and spirit at every nanosecond of time. So in this process, there's a traditional Latin phrase that, if you don't mind, I'd like to explain briefly.
Sure.
It's called, this Latin phrase goes like this: mysterium tremendum et fascinans. The common element between these two aspects is the mystery. That is to say, it's not something within the ordinary range of our knowledgeable faculties. And it comes upon us as a normal rule as the result of this process of developing the divine intimacy that we've just gone through. But at some point, the rest is not only restful or beyond concepts and words, but is overwhelming. In other words, it's a moment of extreme wonder, awe, reverence, gratitude, amazement, and wonder all wrapped into one. And if we don't have some preparation for it, it may be frightening. Tremendum means overwhelming, enormous, inconceivable, and yet present. And so it's like looking out on the universe nowadays. I mean, here we are on the Earth, and our whole idea of ourselves has changed with the discovery of the galaxies moving away from a central point at enormous speed, so that in another generation or two, you won't even be able to see them because they're too far away for the light to get back to us, ever. So the universe itself is a mysterium tremendum. It's just, you can't imagine what it is. Without end, or wherever the heck it's going, and at ever-increasing speeds, apparently. Here, we're confronted by the mystery itself, by our source, by this hidden and secret presence that has been within us all our life long, and which suddenly introduces itself not through concepts or feelings, but as it actually is. And this is overwhelming for the human spirit when it first occurs. And yet it doesn't, you don't want to run away, because the other aspect is inherent in the very character of the overwhelming experience, and that is the mysterium fascinans, which is the fascination of the mystery and the irreversible desire to penetrate it to its depths. In other words, there's two poles going on. One is repelling, and the other is drawing, and they're both irresistible. So it's a double bind, you might say, for the human experience, in which you can't say yes or no to either, but all you can do is to surrender without judgment and let go of everything that we consider our own, and to let God be God within us. It's that experience that is contemplation in the fullest sense of the word in the Christian tradition, or something like enlightenment in the Eastern traditions. And it's the fruit of the previous stages in which our faculties, by assimilating the message of the text, is able to handle such a marvelous experience. That is only, God is awesome. God is God, or the higher power is so high that to experience its raw presence without the reassuring attraction of love would be shattering. I remember a young man, he came to our guest house who'd had such an experience without any context. He had no religious training. He didn't think of it as God. He just thought he was going crazy and experiencing a presence that was unbearable. But as soon as he heard that this was a normal development, or that God, this presence, was loving or present within him and sustaining him all his life long until that moment with the creative energy, and that all he needed was to add the further dimension that is also love, caring, nurturing, then he found peace. So to make a brief resume or summary of this conversation then, the process of divine intimacy can be done in various ways. But one of the most traditional paths in all the traditions is the one of sacred reading, or more exactly, listening with receptivity, respect, and complete attentiveness for the period in which one is engaged with the text. It consists also in a certain sensitivity to follow the attraction to reflect and not to rush on out of habit of speed reading or our usual way of dealing with literature, which is, to read it fast and pick out a few thoughts and throw it away. No, it's a tendency to find in every sentence something worth doing without exaggerating or mythologizing the value of any particular word or sentence. It's It's the general text that is communicating to us a wisdom and a behavior that we need to receive at a deep level. Reflecting then prepares our faculties that this is worth doing and begins to undermine our facile, prepackaged values and preoccupations and ideas of where we will find happiness based on the emotional programs for happiness of early childhood, for the instinctual gratification as soon as possible of power needs, affection needs, and security needs. And when these reflections awaken a certain emotional desire for the good things we're reading about, or hope that our recovery is possible, or that our relationships, at least some of them, might be healed, that we might begin to lead a life that is fully integrated in human society. All of these involve emotional reactions that are powerful to change some of our basic attitudes or habitual ways of acting. And finally, when the emotions have subsided a bit and the thoughts have simplified into such simple things as I'm getting well, or I feel better, or I'm grateful, then you let the words go. And the movement into that loving presence, like between two ancient spouses, to the good symbol of the contemplative attitude, begins to arise. And then you realize that this higher power you're dealing with loves us infinitely, is caring, nurturing, motherly, and is leading us through these stages, and that our feelings are not just punishments for having acted in an irresponsible way, but are healing the deepest wounds, deeper than our addiction, which is the addictive process that Bill W. experienced. That brings, and it's only at that level that emotional sobriety is fully possible as a habitual way of life. The experience of the mysterium tremendum and fascinans may be few and far between, but they're life-changing. And it's they which give us the full strength, honesty, and capacity to look at our lives and our weakness, our brokenness, and the mess we sometimes have made of relationships without distress, with a certain contentment. Not that we did wrong, but that we did it, and that we're not going to let it stand in the way of our healing ourselves and whatever way we can with the relationships that we wounded. In other words, we're prepared to make amends. And so the experience of love enables us to come to life in the fullest sense of the word, and to lay aside or relativize those programs for happiness, which, when they were withheld, or when gratification was withheld, led to a need to get away from that pain, which is the addictive process that landed us in some particular addiction, and which will land us in another addiction if we recover from alcohol, unless we attain emotional sobriety through the deep knowledge of the higher power and our surrender to God's will in every aspect of our lives.
Thank you, Father. It's been a difficult topic, and I wasn't sure when we started it that you'd cover it so thoroughly. I appreciate all your comments this morning. Do you have any further comments before we close?
Well, maybe some aspect of what I mentioned raised some further question in your mind, or... Maybe you want me to
Well,
elucidate a little further on some issue that was obscure.
one thing occurred to me when you just mentioned the Mysterium Tremendum. Would you think that sort of a weak way to describe that would be the spiritual awakening? Would that fit?
Yes, it would.
Yeah.
Most people are not spiritually awakened. That's why they're looking for happiness in the wrong places, to the great injury to their relationships with the higher power, themselves and other people. And that's why the experience of God, even though awesome and overwhelming, is the ultimate source of true humility, which is to accept reality as it is. It's nothing more complicated. But we normally can't do that until we have relativized our emotional expectations of what life is supposed to give us or what happiness is, which our cultural conditioning has offers us and reinforces day by day through mass media and all forms of institutions, sometimes including religious practice that is merely external. So I venture to say that a merely external working of 12 steps will not bring about this transformation. Hence, as a practical point, the prayerful reading or the attentive reading, whatever language is suitable for AA members, that impresses upon them the importance of this assimilation of the wisdom of the founders is extremely foundational for achieving the emotional sobriety, which is the ultimate recovery, or the greatest security for recovery insofar as it's accessible in this world.
So what you've described today could be, we could describe it as a pathway to spiritual awakening.
Exactly. That's exactly what it is. That's my understanding of what the 12-step program is. Perhaps we'll discuss that more fully when we're doing some questions about the 12th
The 12 step.
There is one addition I'd like to make. I noticed in your introductory remarks, you said that I was trying to make a contribution to two practices from the Christian contemplative tradition. One was this process of divine intimacy, called Lectio Divina in the Latin tradition, and the primary practice of monks over the centuries. So it's not something untried or something new I'm suggesting, but simply trying to epitomize adequately a tradition that is the fruit of enormous experience and thousands of lives. But the other is the renewal of contemplative prayer in the Christian tradition through the practice of centering prayer. So just a word to add about the possibility of using centering prayer as an 11th step, since the 11th step is up to whatever one chooses as a form of meditation and prayer. Centering prayer is especially designed to further this process by reducing some of the difficulties that can emerge. As you know, there's nothing that humans do that doesn't contain some obscurity, some difficulty, some confusion, and sometimes missing the whole journey. What I'm trying to say here is that centering prayer emphasizes the resting in God, or the final stage of the process of divine intimacy. It's a distinct process, but it furthers or complements this process by a period of time, usually 20 minutes again, but not the same 20 minutes, you can't do both at once, in which one cultivates the great injunction of the Psalms to be still and see that I am God. That's the direct quotation from that psalm. So it means that resting in God is something that can be accessed directly without each time passing through these preliminary steps that we call Lectio Divina. And it consists primarily in simply being in the presence of God and deliberately or intentionally letting go of other thoughts, even good thoughts, even thoughts about God. In other words, for the time being, we've moved into a specially graced moment of intimacy in which it's the experience of being that counts and of self-surrender, rather than in the intermediary of words, emotions, feelings, thoughts, etc. So it's another way of accessing the mysterium tremendum et fascinans, but without the intermediary of these preliminary steps, at least in connection with the centering prayer practice. I'm thinking that the centering prayer practice, I raise this only as a question, could be appropriately considered for those who had an attraction to it at the 6th and 7th steps of the AA path to awakening. The 6th step, as I understand it, is we became willing that God would take away our faults. Is that correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, this is an interesting statement following the grand inventory and sharing our whole life of misdemeanors with the sponsor. You'd think the next step would be, for God's sake, do something about it and correct these faults. But that isn't the 6th step. And you don't even pray to be delivered until the 7th step. So this is an enormous insight that is also present in the Christian path, which is alerted to the fact that we don't do this process ourselves. And by trying, we find out that effort doesn't work. And that the only thing that makes it work is giving ourselves over entirely to the higher power, or God, as we call this in the Christian tradition. It means that we're invited to look into the depths of our motivation. And here is where centering prayer would add into the depths of our unconscious motivation. Because centering prayer, by resting in God and by presenting our faculties with the attraction of silence and following that silence out of our ordinary psychological awareness to the intuitive level of the passive intellect, the intuitive level, and the spiritual will, this opens us to and makes us vulnerable to the contents of the unconscious. And I venture to say that that's the source of everybody's problem to begin with, whether you're in AA or not. And that's why people fall into a depression after 10 years of sobriety, because they haven't yet found the motivation that is still hidden in the unconscious. That at least was Bill W.'s experience. And so a method that makes us vulnerable to the unconscious, especially after we have established a certain intimacy, friendliness, and at easeness with God through these first 3 steps of reading, reflecting, responding. Now we are strong enough and humble enough to allow the mixed motivation, the selfish motivation, and the childish ways of acting to come to consciousness. Naturally, this is a little painful in the beginning, but the regular practice of this resting in God also involves so much affirmation of our basic goodness that we're able to balance the negative awareness of the shadow side, as Jung calls it, or our personality traits that are driving our friends up the wall, and the positive goodness that is beginning to emerge from the treasures of being the image of God. The treasures meaning the conviction in the divine indwelling and our capacity to relate to God at ever deepening levels and to be fully awakened, enlightened, transformed. All these words mean about the same thing from different points of view or traditions. So this centering prayer could be a very strong ally of the 12 steps for those who can connect with it, who might be attracted to it. It certainly is already being used by some members of the 12-step groups as an 11th step, as a particular method in which to apply the 11th step to their spiritual experience. But it could begin a little sooner if you want to hasten this process. It could be a little more difficult, and that would have to be an issue that sponsors would have to judge in a particular case, whether practicing something that loosens up the dark side of our personality so that it comes from unconscious motivation into conscious motivation so that we then can let it go, along with the emotional pain that accompanied the frustration that was also hidden in the unconscious. So if we allow the divine indwelling or the higher power to heal the unconscious, then the addictive process is ended and there'll be no more addictions. There will be preferences, there will still be emotional feelings of distress, but they will not touch the deep peace or calm, or what the Psalms call the rock on which we're based and in which we can take refuge. The high tower is another expression you get in the Psalms. It means the interior abyss of strength and power that is our coming to awareness of the divine indwelling, which is the true security, the true freedom, the true love of our lives, and the only thing that can meet the infinite desires for truth, goodness, beauty, and happiness that's inherent in being God's image, and we can't change it. But we can always revive it if it's been buried under various addictive damage over the course of the human lifetime.
Well, I think that's a great observation. And I particularly agree in regard to the sixth step, because looking at AA newcomers, those first 5 steps, they're going through, they're really cleaning house, and they're not ready for a deep examination of their unconscious while they're doing that. But maybe in the sixth step, to some degree, they could start some process like that of deepening their experience in prayer.
Yes. You see, the sixth step, seems to me, presupposes that you don't know your faults or your attachments to them, or the amount of energy you put into these programs for happiness. It's all unconscious. So you need a step there that exposes us to the unconscious for the full meaning of the sixth step, it seems to me, to emerge. I became willing. We're not willing. We rather like our faults, and we don't even know that we do, because our love, our attachment is in the unconscious. So the sixth step presupposes that we've moved far enough to be willing, as our faults emerge, to have them taken away. If we were willing, God would take them away right away. That's the condition. So you have to be willing before you pray to have them taken away. Otherwise, you'd be kind of hypocritical, asking for something you don't really want.
Another observation is often people that have, quote unquote, taken the 12 steps that are in AA for a few years, their sponsor will move them back to the sixth step to review it, because they recognize that they still haven't cleaned house the way they should, and they see the disastrous results in their lives, so they send them back to the sixth to review, to study. But if they went back to the sixth and somehow incorporated the concepts of the practice of centering prayer, they may be able to go to that deep level that will give them the healing that they need. Have you covered everything, Father?
Yes.
Yep. I just like to thank you for this. You've covered the topic so well. I think there's a huge need in AA for reading the steps in depth and experiencing them, and maybe structuring step meetings or workshops so that they could lead us naturally to an in-depth absorption of the principles they represent. This absorption or non-absorption could be the difference between life and death for many alcoholics. Because the stakes involved and because of the increasing complexity of the world that we live in, I think we don't have too many moments to lose to implement this. This weekend interview with you, Father Thomas, with God's help, may be the starting point for a renewal within AA that could have global implications. Thank you, Father.
Is there room for a PS?
PS is always room for a PS.
And that is, for practical purpose, if there is some value in this process of learning how to read as listening, so that the wisdom of one's tradition, whatever that is truly assimilated and interiorized, then it would seem that instruction in how to do this would be part of the fundamental teaching, or even an introduction to the fundamental teaching of AA. Once people come to the meeting, they need to hear this fairly soon so that they're really absorbing what they're reading and not, as you said, just sort of sliding up the stairs.
Perhaps a workshop of some kind on how to do the steps might be a good idea.
A workshop, or to have at least training for sponsors, so that many could then impart this material privately. If so many groups are ongoing, you don't perhaps want to hear the same thing over and over again, or really need to. But some practical way of communicating how to make the most use out of the treasures of the 12 steps and the 12 traditions. It would seem to be, would probably enable more people to persevere in the difficult starting out years.
And stay alive. Thank you, Father.